Imagine yourself as a 10-year-old girl in ancient Rome, playing with your dolls in the courtyard of your family's home. The sun filters through the columns as your mother hums softly, weaving nearby, while your father discusses business with clients. It's a typical morning in 57 BCE until the sound of ceremonial horns echoes through the neighborhood. The Pontifex Maximus is coming to make his selection. You peek from behind your mother's robes, as the highest priest in Rome examines the gathered children. His gaze scans each face with cold precision. When his eyes fall on you, time feels like it stops. He raises his staff, speaks the words that will forever change your life. This one serves Vesta. Your mother collapses to her knees, crying uncontrollably. Your father stands rigid, knowing that refusal to comply will bring death to the entire family. You're confused. Everyone is crying. But you've been chosen for the highest honor a Roman girl can receive. What you don't understand is that you've just been sentenced to 30 years of sacred terror, followed by punishments so cruel that death would almost seem like a release. Before we delve deeper into these long-forgotten stories of suffering and survival, if you find uncovering the hidden roots of history fascinating, consider hitting the like button and subscribing. I'd love to know where you're listening from, so please share in the comments below. It's incredible that we can explore these ancient tales together, across time and space, united by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, let's explore the 3 most horrific punishments that awaited Rome's Vestal Virgins. What you're about to hear isn't found in typical history books, because the reality was far too disturbing for sanitized accounts. These weren't just misguided religious ceremonies gone wrong. They were calculated methods of torture designed to control women through fear, disguised as divine justice. Being chosen as a Vestal Virgin wasn't an honor, it was a kidnapping, sanctioned by the state and blessed by the gods. The criteria were terrifyingly specific. The girl had to be between the ages of 6 and 10, with both parents alive, born to Roman citizens, and free from any physical defects. She needed to be the product of a legally valid marriage, symbolically perfect in every way. But here's what many don't realize about the selection process. Families lived in constant fear when the Pontifex Maximus came to make his rounds. Parents would hide their daughters, sending them to relatives in distant provinces, feigning sudden illnesses, or even disfiguring them temporarily with cosmetics to make them unsuitable. The selection wasn't a celebration, it was a fear-driven event. When a girl was chosen, everything changed in an instant. She was taken from her family that very day, never to return home. Her birth name was erased and replaced with a title that marked her as property of the goddess Vesta. From that moment on, she couldn't inherit property, couldn't own land, and couldn't even write letters without supervision. She was no longer an individual, she was a vessel of the gods. The house of the Vestales, where she would live for the next 3 decades, was described by ancient writers as the most beautiful prison ever built. Located near the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, the house featured marble columns, lush gardens, and luxurious furnishings. But beneath the beauty lay the reality: the girl was now a prisoner, her every move monitored by senior Vestal priests. Her education began with the 3 sacred laws that would govern every aspect of her life. First, she must remain a virgin for 30 years, with no possibility of marriage or intimacy. Second, she must obey the Pontifex Maximus's senior religious authorities without question. Third, she must maintain the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta, which was believed to protect Rome itself. These weren't suggestions, they were laws backed by brutal punishments. The young girl quickly learned that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to Rome, and Rome had a very specific idea of what should happen to women who failed in their duties. The Vestales were told they were sacred, chosen by the gods, and blessed above all other women in the empire. What they weren't told was that this sacred status made their punishments even more severe. Because they were holy, they could not be executed like common criminals. Instead, Rome developed unique methods of torture that preserved their sanctity while stripping away their humanity. Ancient sources describe new Vestales weeping for months after their selection, begging to return home, and refusing to eat until they were forcibly fed. Senior Vestales would tell them that resistance was futile, that the goddess had chosen them, and that their suffering was part of their divine duty. But the unspoken message was far simpler and far more terrifying: you belong to us now, forever. The psychological conditioning was thorough and brutal. The girl was taught that her worth was tied entirely to her role as a Vestal. Any mistake, any hint of doubt, any sign of human weakness could trigger a punishment that would make her long for death. But death was not allowed. She was too sacred to kill and too valuable to set free. Rome had perfected the art of destroying the spirit while keeping the body alive. This was not just physical torture, it was institutionalized psychological warfare. If you think the worst part was being chosen as a Vestal virgin, you haven't heard about the first mistake. The sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta was supposed to burn eternally, representing Rome's divine protection in the empire's unbroken existence. If that flame ever went out, it was not just a religious failure, it was seen as treason against the Roman state. When the flame died, an immediate investigation began. The Pontifex Maximus would interrogate each Vestal individually, looking for signs of negligence, distraction, or moral corruption. The questioning could last days, with the girl locked in a windowless room beneath the temple, deprived of food and sleep, until she confessed to some failure. But confession was just the beginning. The punishment was called verbi, and it took place in total darkness deep within the temple complex. The condemned Vestal was stripped naked and bound to a wooden frame specifically built for this ritual. The Pontifex Maximus himself would administer the beating with consecrated rods blessed in Vesta's name. The beatings were not random acts of violence. They were a carefully choreographed ritual, designed to cause maximum pain without breaking the skin. The rods used were meant to inflict internal bruising and damage to the organs, not visible wounds. The Vestal cowled and screamed, because her voice was considered sacred. A leather gag would be placed in her mouth, muffling her cries. She cowled and bled, because her blood was consecrated. The beating was administered with such precision that many Vestales died days later from internal injuries. But the official cause of death was always listed as illness or divine displeasure, never the true cause. The secrecy surrounding these beatings was so complete that most Romans were unaware they even took place. The psychological torture was just as severe. The Vestales never knew when the next inspection would come. They lived in constant fear that a draft might extinguish the flame or that they would make the smallest mistake. This constant anxiety manifested in physical symptoms like tremors, hair loss from stress, and rapid aging, with some Vestales appearing to age decades within months of their first verbi. But the most insidious aspect of this punishment was its randomness. The sacred flame could die from natural causes beyond any Vestal's control. A sudden wind, a structural flaw in the temple, or even sabotage by enemies could extinguish it. But regardless of the cause, the responsibility always fell on the Vestales, and punishment was always inevitable. Some historical accounts suggest that the flame was deliberately extinguished by authorities seeking to punish specific Vestales, either for political reasons or personal grudges. The religious pretext provided perfect cover for what was essentially state-sanctioned torture of defenseless women. The recovery process from verbi was deliberately prolonged to maximize psychological damage. The injured Vestal would be cared for by temple physicians, but their care would be minimal, ensuring that her recovery was slow and painful. Every day, she would be reminded that her suffering was deserved, that she had failed in her sacred duty, and that only perfect service from then on might prevent future punishment. This cycle of trauma and compliance lasted for decades. Vestals who survived verbi ratio became completely subservient, terrified of showing any sign of independence or disobedience that might trigger another round of torture. They no longer had free will. They were transformed from human beings into hollow shells, performing their duties with mechanical precision while their spirits were slowly crushed inside. But the cruelty didn't stop there. There was another punishment waiting for any Vestal who committed the ultimate crime, incestum, the violation of her vow of chastity. The punishment for incestum was execution. It was far worse. The case of Opmia and Floronia in 216 BC. It provides one of the most detailed accounts of this horror. According to the historian Livy, both women were accused of breaking their vow of chastity based on nothing more than gossip and political rivalry. The trial, if it could be called that, was conducted in total secrecy by the College of Pontiffs. There was no defense allowed, no evidence required, just accusations from anonymous sources. When the verdict was announced, the condemned Vestal was told she would be returned to the earth from which all life springs. This seemingly poetic language concealed a punishment so horrific that it defies comprehension. The ritual began at dawn with a procession through the Roman Forum. The condemned Vestal was dressed in a white bridal gown, her hair styled like a new bride, flowers woven into her veil. To the unknowing eye, she might have looked like she was walking to her wedding. In a way, she was marrying death. The procession moved slowly through the streets of Rome, allowing citizens to witness what happened to women who defied sacred law. But the Vestal wasn't allowed to speak, cry, or show any emotion. A wax seal was placed over her mouth to prevent any final words that might stir sympathy from the crowd. Her destination was the Campus S. Hilarity. US, the field of the wicked just outside the city walls. There workers had spent days preparing her final resting place. A chamber was carved into the earth, accessed by a narrow staircase. Once you descended, the staircase would be sealed forever. Inside the chamber, Rome showed its twisted idea of mercy. A bed was provided, along with a small lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a cup of milk. The official justification was that Rome wasn't executing the Vestal. They were simply isolating her and leaving the gods to decide her fate. But this was a cruel legal fiction. The provisions were calculated to last just long enough to prolong her suffering. The oil for the lamp would last no more than 6 hours. The food and water would sustain her for 2 or 3 days at most, but the air in the sealed chamber would run out long before the food did. The Vestal had to walk down the stairs herself. She couldn't be carried because that would make Rome responsible for her death. She had to participate in her own burial, making the final choice to enter the chamber that would become her tomb. Once she reached the bottom, the staircase was quickly dismantled. The workers sealed the opening with earth and stone so tightly that no sound could escape. The surface was smoothed, marked only by a small stone, uninscribed. What happened next is described with chilling detail in ancient sources, making the horror even more unbearable. The condemned Vestal had several hours of lamplight to contemplate her fate. She could see the food and water, she could calculate how long they would last. And she would hear the air growing thinner as the oxygen slowly depleted. Some accounts mention strange sounds coming from the burial sites in the days following these rituals. Workers reported hearing scratching sounds from beneath the earth, perhaps the Vestal's desperate attempts to claw at the walls or wooden planks as she tried to escape. But what was most psychologically devastating was the silence that followed. Her name was erased from public records. Her family was forbidden from mourning her or even speaking her name. The Vestal didn't just die, she was erased from existence, as if she had never been born. This complete erasure from history makes it difficult for modern historians to identify the victims of living burial. We know it happened regularly, but the women who were condemned were forgotten by the very society that had once venerated them. Even though these women were removed from existence in every possible way, their suffering did not end with their burial. After 30 years of service, the surviving Vestales were theoretically free to leave the temple and reintegrate into Roman society. They were given ceremonies in their honor, financial rewards from the imperial treasury, and were even allowed to marry and start families. This might sound like a happy ending after a life of hardship, but the reality was far more sinister. Consider the timing. A girl selected at age 8 would be released at 38, in an era when most Roman women married young and began having children immediately. A 38-year-old woman was considered past her prime for marriage. The promise of freedom was meaningless when the society she had served for decades no longer viewed her as a viable partner for marriage or motherhood. The social challenges she faced were even worse. Roman society believed that a woman who had spent 3 decades in sacred service was fundamentally different from other women. The years of enforced celibacy, coupled with her position as a Vestal virgin, made her seem touched by the gods in a way that made her unsuitable for ordinary human relationships. Many Roman men feared that marrying a former Vestal would bring divine retribution, or that her years of celibacy had somehow corrupted her ability to be a proper wife. The case of Claudia Quinta is a tragic example. After completing her service in 43 CE, she was granted a substantial dowry and introduced to potential husbands from respectable families. However, every engagement was broken after the men's families consulted religious authorities, who declared that marrying a former Vestal would pollute their bloodlines and anger the gods. Claudia spent her remaining years in isolation, living alone outside Rome. She never married, had no children, and died in complete social exile. Her funeral was attended by no one except hired mourners, and she was buried in an unmarked grave. Even the financial rewards promised to former Vestales often didn't materialize. Bureaucratic obstacles and legal technicalities often lead to the reduction or elimination of their pensions. Many of them emerged from the temple, not just socially isolated but economically destitute, with no family support system and few skills to make a living. The psychological scars from 3 decades of institutionalized trauma or worth are more severe than anyone could have imagined. Former Vestales often suffered from what we now recognize as severe PTSD. Panic attacks, paranoid episodes, and difficulty forming normal human relationships became common. Historical records describe former Vestales waking from nightmares, haunted by visions of the sacred flame going out. They would compulsively check locks on doors, unable to bear being touched by anyone. Their spirits had been broken by years of emotional suppression and fear, leaving them unprepared for life outside the temple walls. Some former Vestales, unable to cope with the trauma, attempted suicide. Others retreated into complete isolation, recreating their life in the temple in their own homes, living as ghosts of their former selves. A few tried to reintegrate into society, but found themselves unable to navigate normal social interactions after so many years of being conditioned to perform rituals and follow commands without question. The most tragic cases involved former Vestales, who developed what was called sacred madness. These women would wander through Rome, claiming to receive divine visions from Vesta, preaching in public spaces, and performing bizarre rituals. Roman authorities typically ignored these behaviors, treating them as the ramblings of harmless lunatics, never considering that these women were victims of a system that had systematically destroyed their minds and spirits. Perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that some former Vestales were recruited back into temple service as advisors or supervisors, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Having survived their own torture, they became complicit in training new generations of victims, continuing the tradition of fear and suffering for years to come. The promise of freedom after 30 years of service turned out to be the cruelest deception of all. These women had sacrificed their youth, their fertility, their families, and their sanity for Rome. In return, they were given social exile, financial ruin, and psychological destruction. The trauma they experienced was not just physical, it was deeply embedded in the fabric of their existence, shaping who they were and who they would become. The Vestales stories are not just tragic, they serve as a stark reminder of the lengths to which societies will go to control and manipulate those without power. Rome, with all its grandeur and glory, built its empire not only through military conquest, but by creating systems that extracted the very soul from its citizens. The Vestales, as much as they were revered, were also tools of control, caught in a web of religious duty that blurred the line between sacred service and brutal subjugation. What makes the story of the Vestal Virgins even more horrifying is the way it was normalized. In a society that prided itself on its piety, these women were seen as blessed, chosen by the gods for a task that was both sacred and revered. Yet beneath the surface, this religious veneration was a mask for a deeply exploitative system. These women weren't just victims of individual cruelty or isolated incidents. They were the casualties of a centuries-old program designed to control female autonomy through institutionalized terror. The Vestales' suffering was masked by the language of divine duty and sanctity, making their mistreatment nearly invisible to the public. The religious justification gave Rome the perfect cover for their actions. It wasn't just about maintaining a sacred flame or keeping a vow of chastity. It was about power, about bending women to the will of the state, about ensuring that those who were chosen for this task would never be able to escape the system. The psychological manipulation they endured was sophisticated and relentless. From the moment they were selected, their humanity was stripped away. They were told that they were sacred, that their suffering was for the good of Rome, and that their pain was necessary for the survival of the empire. Over time, this conditioning became so ingrained that they could no longer distinguish between what was real and what they had been taught to accept. Their value was no longer tied to their individual identity or worth, but to their obedience to a system that demanded sacrifice without end. Even when the Vestales were ethnically free, their lives were marked by the scars of their service. Socially ostracized and economically abandoned, many were left to live out their remaining years in isolation, rejected by the society they had served so faithfully. The promise of freedom, like so many promises in Roman society, turned out to be empty and hollow. This cycle of controls, suffering, and compliance wasn't unique to Rome. It echoes throughout history, from the control of women in ancient civilizations to the ways women have been exploited, manipulated, and silenced in modern times. The Vestales were a reflection of a deeply ingrained belief that women could be controlled through fear, shame, and religious justification, beliefs that still linger in many parts of the world today. The case of the Vestal Virgins is one of the darkest chapters of Rome's history, but it's also a story that holds lessons for us today. It teaches us about the dangers of unchecked power, the ways in which institutions can exploit the vulnerable, and the importance of challenging systems that perpetuate suffering in the name of tradition or religion. The Vestales may be forgotten by most of history, but their suffering serves as a warning that even in the most advanced societies, there are those who will use religion, duty, and law as tools of oppression. And while the ancient world may seem distant, the echoes of their experiences can still be felt today. Whether it's the silencing of women's voices, the justification of cruelty through the guise of tradition, or the exploitation of those who are vulnerable, the Vestales story is a timeless reminder of the need to stand against systems that dehumanize others. In reflecting on the plight of the Vestales, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the ways in which power is wielded and sustained, often at the expense of the vulnerable. The Vestales were chosen not for their worth, but for their ability to conform to a system that demanded their complete obedience, sacrifice, and suffering. The ancient Romans, with their grandeur and glory, created a society where women's autonomy was not just suppressed, but systematically erased in the name of tradition and divine will. This was not simply a matter of religious devotion. It was a calculated move by those in power to ensure that the power structures of Rome would remain unchallenged. By taking young girls, forcing them into a life of servitude, and then stripping away their identities, the Roman state ensured that these women would never question their role. They were made to believe that their suffering was noble, their sacrifice for the greater good. Yet, as we look back, we must ask ourselves, how often does history repeat itself? How many systems, even today, perpetuate cycles of exploitation under the guise of tradition, religion, or law? Just as the Vestales were convinced their suffering was sacred, countless others are made to believe that their suffering is part of a greater cause. The political and religious leaders of Rome exploited the power of belief, and they did it with such precision that even those subjected to cruelty believed they were acting in the service of something greater than themselves. The Vestales story serves as a reminder that cruelty often hides behind the most beautiful of facades. We see it in the temples of Rome, adorned with marble columns and elegant gardens. But the true cost of that beauty was hidden in the suffering of women, whose lives were reduced to nothing more than vessels for state control. The temples, with their grandeur, represented not just divine power but also the quiet, relentless oppression of women who were denied any form of agency. As modern societies, we are far removed from the ancient world, but the ways in which power continues to function remain eerily similar. The mechanisms of control that were used to maintain Roman society continue to echo through time. Whether through economic inequality, political oppression, or social systems that limit personal freedoms, there are still countless women and men who find themselves trapped in cycles of abuse and exploitation. The story of the Vestal Virgins should not just be seen as an ancient tragedy. It is a living history, one that serves as a call to action for all of us. Their story forces us to reckon with our own systems and institutions. Are we complicit in maintaining structures that oppress the vulnerable? Are we comfortable with the idea that, in many ways, some lives are valued more than others? The Vestales, in their silence and suffering, left behind a powerful legacy. They didn't just represent the fragility of life in ancient Rome, they embodied the power of resistance. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, they fought, in their own way, by simply surviving. And their story is a challenge to us all to stand up against the systems that seek to strip us of our humanity and to question the structures that continue to perpetuate injustice. It's up to us to ensure that their stories don't fade into obscurity, that their suffering is not forgotten. As we look back on their lives, we are reminded of the importance of resisting systems that silence the voices of the oppressed. The Vestales may have been erased from history, but their pain and their resistance are not lost. It's our responsibility to remember them not just as victims, but as symbols of the strength and resilience that exist within all of us, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The story of the Vestal Virgins is a sobering reminder of how deeply ingrained systems of power and control can be. These women, chosen for their purity and devotion, were forced to live lives of constant surveillance, fear, and suffering, all under the guise of sacred duty. Their stories are not just about ancient Roman rituals. They speak to the timeless struggles faced by those who are subjugated by societal expectations and political powers. What's particularly haunting is how effectively the Roman state used religion to justify such brutal treatment. In the name of divine order, these girls were stripped of their identities, their freedom, and their futures. The state didn't just claim their bodies, it claimed their minds, twisting their understanding and sacrifice until they believed that their torment was part of a greater plan, a necessary act to ensure the survival of the empire. But what happens when this kind of control over the body and spirit is normalized? What happens when suffering is disguised as virtue? When injustice is hidden behind the veil of tradition, it's easy to dismiss the Vestales as part of an ancient, far-off world. But in truth, their experiences reflect the continued struggle for power in our own time, where those with authority still use manipulation and fear to maintain control. The Vestales weren't old, they were chosen by the gods, but in reality, they were imprisoned by the very system that claimed to honor them. Their sanctity, their virginity, became tools for Rome to assert its dominance, not just over the Vestales themselves, but over all of Roman society. These women were forced into a role they never chose, their lives forever marked by an institution that used their bodies as instruments of state control, and the consequences of that control were devastating, not only in their time but also in the legacy they left behind. Once freed from their sacred service, many former Vestales were rejected by Roman society. Their freedom after decades of servitude was a cruel illusion. A woman who had spent her youth in isolation, cut off from family and the chance to build a life, was suddenly thrust into a world that no longer had room for her. Rejected by potential husbands and ostracized by society, their so-called freedom was just another form of punishment. The cycle of trauma these women endured didn't end with their release. Even after their service was over, many carried the weight of their years in the temple, both physically and mentally. The emotional scars were profound, as they had been conditioned to live in constant fear and obedience. The brutal training they underwent, the cruelty they faced, stayed with them for the rest of their lives. This sense of isolation and alienation was just a product of ancient Rome. It's a reflection of how societies throughout history have marginalized, controlled, and discarded those who were seen as expendable. The Vestales were not alone in their suffering. Women across the ages have faced similar struggles, caught in systems that dictated their worth and stripped them of their autonomy. Today, the Vestales story remains relevant because it speaks to the ways we continue to see power exerted over vulnerable populations, particularly women. The tools of oppression may change, but the methods remain the same: silence, isolation, fear, and manipulation. It's easy to look at the past and think that we've moved beyond such practices. But when we look closer, we realize that the legacies of those ancient systems still haunt us today. Whether it's the exploitation of women's bodies, the silencing of their voices, or the psychological manipulation that keeps them in subjugation, the echoes of Rome's treatment of the Vestales can be found in every society where the powerless are controlled through fear and coercion. The true challenge of remembering the Vestales isn't just about acknowledging the horrors they endured. It's about recognizing how those same structures of control continue to operate in our world today. If we are to break free from the cycles of injustice, we must confront the ways in which power still operates in hidden, insidious ways. We must resist the temptation to accept cruelty disguised as tradition, to challenge the systems that profit from exploitation, and to give a voice to those who continue to suffer in silence. As we reflect on the lives of the Vestales, we are reminded that the fight for justice is ongoing. Their story, buried for so long in the annals of history, is not just a relic of the past, it's a call to action for the present. The courage to stand up against oppressive systems, to recognize the suffering of those who are silenced, and to demand change is not only a tribute to the Vestales, but to every individual who has ever fought for their right to exist freely without fear. The Vestales story demands more than just remembrance, it calls us to action. In a world that often glosses over the painful truths of history, it's easy to lose sight of the lessons that these forgotten women have to teach us. Their suffering was not an isolated incident, it was part of a larger pattern of control and repression that spans across centuries, cultures, and societies. The cruelty inflicted upon the Vestales wasn't just about punishing individual women for failing in their sacred duty. It was about maintaining a system of power that kept women in their place silenced, obedient, and subservient. Their stories, erased from public memory, serve as a powerful warning about the dangers of unchecked authority, the fragility of individual freedom, and the lengths to which societies will go to control their most vulnerable members. The Vestales, as tragic as their fate was, were not just victims, they were symbols of a system that valued compliance over humanity. Their ability to survive, to endure the unbearable, speaks to the strength and resilience of the human spirit, even when faced with unimaginable oppression. But it also reminds us that survival isn't enough. True freedom requires more than mere existence. It requires the ability to live without fear, to have control over one's own body and destiny. As we look at the world today, the echoes of the Vestales' plight still resonate. While the specific practices of ancient Rome are long gone, the mechanisms of control they represent are still very much alive. Women and marginalized groups continue to face systems of exploitation, whether through economic inequality, political subjugation, or societal pressures that demand compliance and silence. The struggle for autonomy, for the right to live freely and without fear, is a battle that is far from over. In many parts of the world, women are still denied basic rights over their bodies, their choices, and their future. Just as the Vestales were forced to live according to rules set by others, women today are still subjected to patriarchal systems that dictate how they should behave, what they should believe, and what their worth is based on. In some cases, these systems are disguised as religious or cultural practices, much like the Roman justification for the suffering of the Vestales. In others, they are embedded in legal and political structures that maintain inequality and control. But there is hope. The story of the Vestales is not just a tale of suffering, it is a testament to the strength of those who survive under oppressive systems. It is a reminder that even when the odds are stacked against us, even when we are told that our voices don't matter, there is power in resistance. The Vestales may have been silenced in their time, but their story lives on. It's our job to keep telling it, to ensure that their suffering is not forgotten, and to use their experiences as a guide for how we can fight against the systems that continue to oppress. We must ask ourselves, what can we do today to honor the Vestales and all those who have suffered in silence? The answer lies not in passive remembrance, but in active resistance, in the fight for equality, for justice, and for the right to live freely and without fear. The Vestales story is not just about a distant past, it is about the present. And it will continue to be about the future, as long as we allow systems of power to dictate who is worthy and who is expendable. Their lives were stolen, their names erased, but their message remains. They were human beings, not just religious symbols, not just sacrifices for a greater cause. They were real women with real pain, and their stories deserve to be remembered. As long as we continue to fight for those who are silenced, to stand up for those who are oppressed, we carry their legacy forward. Let us honor the Vestales not by seeing them as victims of the past, but as survivors whose suffering sparked a need for change. They are not forgotten, they are the voices that push us to make sure that no one is ever silenced again. As we continue to reflect on the Vestales' painful story, it becomes clear that their suffering was not in vain. Their legacy is not simply one of pain, but of endurance, resistance, and a silent call for justice that we are only now beginning to truly understand. The story of the Vestales is a symbol of how societies can use the guise of piety and tradition to impose oppressive systems. Systems that can last for centuries, unnoticed and unchallenged, until they are brought into the light. Their story compels us to think about our modern, day systems of control, which, like those in ancient Rome, often exploit power dynamics to maintain the status quo. Whether through economic systems that silence the voices of the poor, political systems that silence the voices of the oppressed, or societal structures that limit the freedom and potential of marginalized groups. These systems are not so different from the one that enslaved the Vestales. But their story also urges us to think critically about the ways we allow ourselves to be controlled, manipulated, and made to feel that our suffering is somehow for a greater cause. Just as the Vestales were taught to believe that their pain was part of a divine purpose, so too are we sometimes made to believe that our sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. We are told that certain struggles are just part of the human condition, that suffering is inevitable, and that we must simply endure. The story of the Vestales reminds us that this is a dangerous lie. Suffering should never be normalized or justified. We must not let ourselves become complacent in the face of injustice. The Vestales lies that power, whether in the hands of religious institutions, political leaders, or societal norms, can become a weapon used to break spirits, erase identities, and control entire populations. But the Vestales also remind us that even in the most oppressive systems, resistance is possible. The Vestales' endurance, their silent rebellion, and their very survival is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. They may have been forced into their roles, but they did not break. They survived not just physically, but through the very act of continuing to exist. Their story is not just one of suffering, it's a story of survival, of the quiet, unspoken resistance that happens when people refuse to let the system completely define them. It is a reminder that even when everything is taken from us, our will to endure and fight for our humanity remains. The Vestales were punished for being women who existed outside of the boundaries set for them. They were punished for having bodies, for having desires, for simply being human. And yet, in their endurance, in their survival, they fought back in the only way they could. By existing, by refusing to be erased from history. We can learn from their strength. Today we must continue their silent rebellion by speaking out, by recognizing the systems that still control and oppress, and by working to break them. The Vestales may have been forced into submission, but their story is not one of submission. It is a story of defiance, and it is a story that lives on because we continue to share it. Let the Vestales' suffering serve as a call to us all to question the systems we live under, to never accept cruelty as part of the way things are, and to recognize the hidden suffering that persists around us. It is our duty to listen to the stories that have been erased from history, to acknowledge the pain that still reverberates from those who came before us, and to ensure that such cruelty is never allowed to repeat itself. Their story may have been buried, but it is time we bring it to the surface, to honor the voices that were silenced, and to ensure that the memory of their suffering transforms into a force for change, for justice, and for a world where no one is ever forced to suffer in silence again.